deeply humbled that he thought I could make a presentation here. So thank you very much for that. I'm quite humbled by that. So searching for a topic to talk about, and our host suggested I talk about gurus and the history of gurus in India. So I hope I can accomplish that over here. So can we go to the next slide, please? So you might wonder about the etymology of the word guru. Where does the etymology come from? So we have an Upanishad, and I'll talk a little bit about what the Upanishad is. The Advaya Taraka Upanishad, which is attached to the Shukla Yajurveda. So in verse 16 is a description of a guru, which you've already heard before when the students presented their work. The syllable gu means darkness, and the syllable ru means he who dispels them. And because of the power to dispel darkness, the guru is thus named. And this is from the Upanishadic definition of what a guru is. Can we go to the next slide? Obviously, the thoughts going through my mind is, who perhaps is the first guru? So, in the Indian tradition, we follow something called the non-duality of reality. I apologize that there is a lot of jargon philosophical loaded in that one phrase, but there is something very deep about duality and non-duality. It might suffice to say that most of the Western traditions are dual, and the Indic systems are non-dual. So in the non-dualistic version of reality, we accord Mahadeva Shiva as the first guru, who was an Adi Yogi, and the students, the Saptarishis, who are immortalized as the 7 stars that you see in the sky, the Big Dipper, as the first gurus who taught the world. Can we go to the next slide, please? There's also qualifications of a guru. In the Western tradition, and perhaps everywhere in the modern world today, you have accrediting authorities who decide who can teach. If you want to teach, you go to university, you get a degree or a certificate in teaching, and you're allowed to teach either elementary, middle school, high school, or engineering college, or doctorates, and so on. So you have an accrediting authority that decides who's qualified to teach. And we did have those kind of notions also. Who qualifies to be a guru? You don't find guru accrediting authorities anywhere. But what you do have is, in verse 14 of the same Upanishad, the Advaya Taraka Upanishad, the qualification of who's a competent guru. It says somebody who's well versed in the Vedas, and here when you see a devotee of Vishnu, you had to fill in over there somebody who's aware of divinity. The divinity known at that time was Vishnu. So a devotee of Vishnu who's devoid of spite, who knows yoga and practices it, and full of devotion to his own guru, who knows Brahman, such an acharya is known as a guru. Now there's a lot to say about each of these things. So I'm afraid with the 15 minutes that we have, I won't suffice to say about all of those things. But as we go on, I might expand a little bit of each of these themes, what they mean. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we heard that a guru dispels darkness, and you must be wondering, what is this darkness they're talking about? I mean, this light, this dark, and what is this darkness that we're talking about? So in the Indic systems, Indic has been a short form for the Indian civilization systems, we have something called Vidya and Avidya. Vidya is, broadly speaking, all the things that are said over here. Avidya, when you attach a word like a in front of a word, it is the opposite in Sanskrit. So avidya is the opposite of wisdom. So one is a wisdom, one is the opposite of wisdom, which you might call ignorance, but it is not really ignorance, it goes far beyond that. Avidya is something where we conflate the impermanence as reality. Now this is once again a loaded phrase. What does it mean? In the Indic systems, we believe that Purusha means the Brahman, the supreme Brahman, who is a manifestation of the creation, both the created and everything else that you can imagine. When the Purusha and manifests itself in the creation through Prakriti meaning the nature, then you have our embodiment where we have something called an Atman conflated with the cosmic being, and our self, material self, equated with Prakriti, nature. So when you take something like, for example, this phone that I have in my pocket, or my watch, or anything, these are objects that seem very real to you. But if you pause to think about it, the metal that was used to mine this came from a mine that existed as ore. That material was changed so that it was purified to form some kind of material over here made into a watch. When I discard it, it's going to once again through processes of chemical reaction, form ores and go back into the mud. Our bodies themselves, right, full of atoms and molecules and all of those kinds of things, eventually we go and become plant food and animal food. That's our future. And that itself forms the basis of future creation and so on. There's an impermanence to the material world which the Hindu sages and the gurus sought to emphasize. So that is what is meant when we say, when we conflate the impermanence as reality and assume there is all there is to it, that kind of wisdom is something that is termed as avidya. It is not that they sought to say all of this is Maya. That is the wrong interpretation of that. It is an illusion in the sense that it is not permanent. It does not mean that they derided it and said it's not worth studying. Even the study of avidya was seen as an intellectual pursuit and formed the basis of vidya. So vidya traditionally meant you study the 6 schools of Hindu philosophy, things like Nyaya, things like Yoga, Vaisheshika, Samkhya, Purva Mimamsa, and Uttara Mimamsa, which includes things like science, learning, philosophy, knowledge, scholarship, and any knowledge, whether it is valid or not, whether it is true or false, also was included as vidya. So vidya was any intellectual pursuit that is worthy of learning. And we have a great guru, one of our gurus from the ancient past, called Patanjali, who was responsible for codifying a lot of yoga that we have today. This guru in the Yoga Sutras also described avidya as a tree whose branches are all of these things. One of those branches is ego. Ego is something that we have when we believe we are distinct from the creation. So when we believe that we are distinct from the creation, that egoism that we have, that I'm a separate being from everything else, is something that constitutes avidya because you don't realize that you're part of the whole cosmos. Similarly, there's something called raga, which is, I can't read this very clearly over here, but things that are not necessary for the present, but still we hanker after them. Then dvesa is something that's opposite of that. You deny the truth, although even when it is present. And abhinava vesa, basically one of peer pressure, that you're afraid of leading a tribe of false beliefs. You just want to stick on because that's peer pressure. So all of these things form the branches that hold up the avidya in ourselves. And Patanjali very neatly makes a metaphor of a tree that holds up this whole thing. Can you go to the next slide, please? So over here, what I would like to do is I'd like to show some of the schools and the gurus of the past. So like I said, Hinduism, there were 6 traditional schools that generated enormous amounts of wisdom, enormous amounts of learning, enormous amounts of contemplative wisdom that went into characterizing the world as they saw it, into characterizing the cosmos as they saw it, characterizing divinity as they saw it. And this led to enormous intellectual ferment, if I might call it that. So we had things like Nyaya, which stated that all knowledge is not intrinsically valid. Most knowledge is not valid unless proven. And truth exists whether we human beings know it or not. And one of the gurus who expounded this way, this line of thinking was Akshapada Gautama, who people say he lived around 600 to 800 BCE, but we have reasons to doubt many of these dates. Yoga, most of you are familiar with yoga asanas, where you're seeing yoga where studios all over the place and people practice yoga, which is a very small portion of what yoga stands for. Yoga is a huge umbrella that has got a lot of things in it. It was a vehicle for the devotee to understand how he's part of the cosmos, to open the inner wisdom in you so that you realize your true nature. It is a vehicle for that. You have things like yamas, niyama, asana, pranayama, which we saw demonstration of, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. These are, you can think of it as a tree where you gradually go on one to the other till you find a state of understanding in the final stage. And we are mostly in asana when we do things like yoga practices, stretching exercises, and so on. This is propounded, not propounded is the wrong word, codified by Patanjali. These are practices that are very well known, and Patanjali is a great guru who wrote all of these things in his Yoga Sutras, which are very famous and available even today. Vaisheshika is one more school of thought in the Indian systems, the Indic systems, which relied on perception and inference. So it was a school of thought where people said that let me have the particularity of something. So although I said the material world is impermanent, so that they didn't say that because it's impermanent, it's all Maya, I don't care about it, I'll go to philosophical pursuit. They didn't do that. They said, let's study the material particularity of things also. So the Rishi Kannada, he expounded a way of perception as well as inference by looking at the particularities of that object, things like the size, things like the atomic nature, things of those things. I'll talk a little bit about this a little later. Samkhya was one more school of thought where there was systematic enumeration and rational examination. In this school with Rishi Kapila was brought a lot of mathematical techniques to the enumeration of mathematical techniques and logic to make sense of the world as we see it. Purva Mimamsa, this was a reflection, consideration, a profound thought, investigation, examination and discussion. And one of the exponents who is known to have done this in more recent times is a guru called Kumarila Bhatta, who's very famous in contemporary India today because he was somebody with whom the next sage I'm going to talk about, Adi Shankara, he debated him. So he's very famous in that sense. Finally, we have something called Uttara Mimamsa, also called today as Vedanta. So today when you see most of Hinduism, it's basically Vedanta, in which there are 10 schools of philosophy over here, including the very well-known Advaita Vedanta, the Vishishtadvaita, and so on, a whole lot of them. And one of the rishis who's most famous for unifying the various philosophical schools of Hinduism and expounding the oneness of the Hindu bedrock is Adi Shankara. Even today when students pray, they say, my prayers to my gurus starts from Mahadeva himself, all the way through the lineage of gurus to my current guru, and you're all the gurus, for example, for some of the students over here, to my current guru, with Adi Shankara in the middle. So it is not merely a citation system. It's not merely I'm citing my knowledge to this person and therefore intellectual honesty requires me to cite it. It's not merely that. It goes far beyond that, because somebody who's capable of opening the inner divinity in you and trying to tell you what is the reason for life and so on, is surely worthy of equating with the divinity that I'm trying to see, especially if you belong to the non-dual school of thought over here. So such a teacher was worthy of praise, such a teacher was worthy of worship even. And in Indic systems, that is very much part of what you're seeing today too. Can you go to the next slide? So I give to you examples of gurus over the ages. And one thing that might be in your mind is, so what are all the intellectual works that these gurus produced? Where are they and what are they? So there are two main things that we have, and you might have observed this in the posters which the children put up over there. One of them is called Shruti. Shruti is a word that stands for that which is heard. Herein for you, if you're a history student, is an indicator that here is information that is reaching to you across from the past. Across from the past, even before there was writing. There was no writing systems and so on. There was only oral records. So people heard it, memorized it, passed it on, heard it, memorized it, passed it on, and things that were heard. So these are the highest accuracy or the highest authority in Hindu scriptures, because these are believed to be divinely inspired. Divinely inspired does not mean that they had some kind of, somebody came and told them and God told them and so on. Many of the rishis went into states of mind accomplished through yoga, into altered states of mind and so on, and they were able to see wisdom, the connections much more clearly than they could if they were immersed in a world of objects, emotions and thoughts. If you're immersed in the world today, you're sitting here wondering about when do I get out, when do I eat, how do I drive back, fight the traffic and so on. So when we are immersed in these worlds of objects, emotions and thoughts, you're unable to see exactly the truths that you might be confronted with. So these rishis were able to go into states of mind that detach them from these chains that hold us, and were able to see some truths. Among Shrutis are things like Vedas, you've all heard about it, 4 Vedas, Rig Veda, Samaya Veda, Yajur, and Atharva Veda. The Samhitas are also a very primary source of information in Hinduism. They include mantras. Mantras are things like hymns, for example, and prayers. Brahmanas are commentaries on the hymns and the rituals. Aranyakas were composed by rishis who renounced all, went to the woods, to the forest and contemplated, and they expounded on the rituals and the philosophy. And finally, Upanishads were philosophies. There are more than 108 known Upanishads. These are roughly like PhD thesis, if you will. Somebody who's gone to deep introspection and understanding of the essence of the Vedas and is able to expound on one area of philosophy very deeply. So the intellectual rigor and content in these Vedas, in this Upanishads, is equivalent perhaps to a PhD. I hope I'm not trivializing what a PhD is by saying what is in here. There's much, much more deeper than that. Can you go to the next slide, please? In accordance with, along with Shruti, you also have something called Smriti. Smriti stands for that which is remembered. Now these are a lesser authority in Hindu scriptures. Just like you have Shruti, the highest authority, these are lesser authority, but no doubt authoritative all the same. Among this are the 6 Vedangas, things like grammar, meter, astronomy, rituals. The Itihasas, most of you might have heard about Mahabharata and Ramayana, they belong over here. Texts on things like Dharma, Artha, Kama and Moksha, you have the Dharma Shastras, you have the Artha Shastra by Chanakya, and so on, you have a lot of them. The Puranas, which are historical accounts, things like Sthala Purana might be the history of a local temple, Purana of temple of king lists and so on. Kavya are poetic works that are also included in Srimati. Bhashyas are also deeply incisive philosophical works equatable to PhD works perhaps. So these are commentaries on the Shrutis. The Sutras and Shastras are various schools of philosophy, and the Nibandhas, which are politics, medicine, culture and arts. So why did I even tell about all of these things? I wanted to give you a flavor of the enormous intellectual content that has been present in this area of the world, done by people who we traditionally refer to as gurus. And so when we teach, we belong to that tradition really, or the tradition of intellectual fervor and trying to appreciate reality and trying to expound the truths that we have learned to others too. Let's go on please, next slide. So here we are, we have the conundrum. We read Socrates, we read Plato, we read a whole lot of other works that we are deeply familiar with, but not Indic sources. Most of us here probably have got no idea. Who are these gurus? How is it that I never heard about them? Where did they live? And why did we not learn about them? I can't address all of these questions, but in the next few slides, I hope to open your minds to just a little bit, something intriguing in our world, that we can have enormous differentiation in the way that we see knowledge. I'll expound. I think hopefully understand the next slide that we see this. So I'd like to present to you a series of slides that will show the antiquity of the Indian civilization. The objective of my next few slides is to show antiquity. Since 1995 or so, there has been a lot of work all over the world in genetic research. The genetic research attempts to address the question of who are we as a people and where did we come from? Where did the ancient peoples come from? Almost all of the works have converged to a certain idea that we are all out of Africa. The modern human, 200,000 years ago, same cranial capacity as you and me, ability for abstract thought, ability for language, ability to use tools, all the same, except that we perhaps have a veneer of civilization and we say they did not have it. But we all accept that they came out of Africa and there was an equilibrium point in India. And they resided here for quite some time, and between 40 to 25,000 years ago, the people from India, from this region of the world, populated the rest of the world. All non-African people are descended from the people who migrated from here. One section went towards Europe and became the future Europeans. Another section went towards Central Asia and onward towards North America and South America. Another section went towards the east, southeastern parts into Australia and so on. So these are the people who inhabited the rest of the world, starting from a place over here, approximately 40 to 25,000 years ago. We have a romanticized vision of who a prehistoric person is. We visualize the caveman with a club on his head, running around and beating a woman and dragging her by her hair. But that is it's a cartoonish image that is far from the truth. These are people who are capable of having an intellectual conversation if you could have the language ability. So these were intellectual people with the same cranial capacity. That's the bottom line. So let's go to the next slide, please. So here are some ancient artifacts that reveal antiquity again, that are known in the recent days in India. Bhimbetka, place in Madhya Pradesh, 35,000 years ago, we have artifacts. In caves in Kerala 9,000 years ago, we have something that looks like writing. And you might have learned that writing originated in the Sumerian cultures and so on, the cuneiform, 3000 BC and so on, but we have evidence of even more ancient writings over here. In Birana and Rakhigar in Haryana in northern India, 10,000 years ago, we have evidence of cities that are very, very ancient. And in Ramchandrapuram, Telangana, 12,000 years ago, Ketar in Andhra Pradesh, 8,000 years ago. Again, the objective is to show to you archaeological finds. The first slide, I showed you the genetic finds, the genetic history that talked to you about the people. Here I showed you the archaeological finds that establish antiquity. Can you go to the next slide? Next, there is now something that's very, very intriguing. Not all of you might be familiar with something called precession of equinox. Precession of equinox is something where the pole star, when the earth is spinning, it looks like there's a point in the sky where the star is not moving. Every other star appears to be in motion in the night sky, except at a certain point, because that is about that point that the earth is rotating, the night and day. Now this point that it's pointing to is not constant. That has got a 26,000 year cycle. It traces a 26,000 year cycle, and because of that, what appears to be the pole star today, Polaris, wasn't the pole star many years ago. 14,000 years ago, a star called Abhijit was a pole star. Abhijit also stands for Vega. In Western tradition, you call it Vega. In Indian tradition, we call it Abhijit. Somebody in the Indian traditions was aware about it, talks about Abhijit having been the pole star, and that finds a presence in the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata, there is an account where the pole star over here, which is, I don't know if you can see it from there, but Abhijit is over here, a pole star. Everything rotates about it. Somebody has noted that 14,000 years ago there was a pole star. So we have astronomical evidence of antiquity of the people too. Can we go to the next slide? Now, something called the Pleiades. Pleiades in the Greek tradition are the stars that, there's a delightful Greek story about how a certain god, I believe it's Hercules or Zeus, was pursuing these 7 maidens, and they ran around here and there, and he was pursuing, Orion was pursuing. The story comes from the Indian systems. It is called the Kritika Nakshatra. This is the photo that I took of the night sky. I'm also an astrophotographer. I took this picture over there. The Samhita, remember I talked to Samhita being one of the primary texts in Hinduism. The Taittiriya Samhita refers to Kritika in the winter solstice, and this corresponds to a date of 8,350 BCE. A pretty long time back. The Shatapada Brahmana refers to Kritika in the vernal equinox, corresponding to 2950 BCE. 3000 BCE almost. Once again, we have data points that fall at us from the literature that if we are able to take our modern software and crank back in time, we are able to correlate some of the observations over there and say when was it in time when this was true. And these are the dates that followed at us. Can we go to the next slide? So what I've tried to show over here is evidence from genetics, evidence from astronomy, evidence from archaeology. All of them seem to come to a point where they show antiquity of a civilization, antiquity of a people. In history, when we talk about history, we talk about the study of epigraphics, we talk about the study of writings, of texts, and so on. What do you do for people who don't have that epigraphy? You're going to a period of time before there was epigraphy, before there was any writing. Does it mean they don't have a history? We colloquially call that prehistory. And we say the myths and so on. We just poo-poo the whole thing away, saying we're not good enough. But as scholars and thinkers, which we teachers and everybody are, I believe we need to go and use these new tools of science, which is genetics, which is astronomical observations, which is things like archaeology, and try to construct narratives that validate some of the observations that people have done. So here you are. I'm not going to read through this, too much of it. All I want to point out is there is a text called Jyotisha Vedanga that records astronomical data of 4000 BC and perhaps up to 11,000 BCE. The sage called Yajnavalkya, 3000 BCE, propounded a heliocentric model. It is also in the Shatapada Brahmana, he wrote that one. He measured the distance from the earth to the sun, earth to the moon, and so on. There are some ideas available through trigonometry. This is not something that is overwhelming, saying, how could you have done that without a telescope and so on. Using simple trigonometry, which you as math teachers, I can show you how this can be done. And they did these kind of things. A text called Surya Siddhanta, perhaps in 700 BCE, records very complex time measurements and so on. 2,000 years ago, Indians proposed stars were like the sun but further away. Aryabhatta had a partial heliocentric model. Other gurus like Varahamira, Brahmagupta, Bhaskara, Sayana, enormous amount of intellectual content over the years as appropriate for an ancient people. Can we go on to the next slide? So over here, I just want to give you some idea, how did this knowledge go out of India to the rest of the world? And we do have evidence that this knowledge went from India to the rest of the world. About 2000 BCE, a famous river called the Saraswati, which is in the northern part of India, dried up on its way to Gujarat, Rajasthan, Gujarat. It went underground. It was not a point event. It was a gradual occurrence which led to a whole lot of peoples migrating out of India. And this migration has been anywhere from 3000 BCE onwards down to current, much later periods. I have shown a blown up picture over here that shows the Babylonians, the Mitannis, the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Kassites, and so on. All of these people whom you might be familiar through biblical records, if you read the Old Testament, you know the fights the peoples they had with the so-called Aryans and so on. These people were in a state of ferment because they were coming into contact with people coming with information over here. Many of the mathematical, astronomical, other such knowledge found its way from here to these parts of the world, and they form the intellectual basis for remaining knowledge transmissions. Can we go to the next slide? We have evidence of this through some things that we are seeing. Knowledge dispersal happened in many periods. Pre-Pythagoras, around 2000 BC, what I just told you. During Pythagoras, around 500 BC, when he is known to have made a visit to India and learned certain things and gone back and started a Gurukulam and started becoming a vegetarian and so on, we know that he took along a lot of things. After Alexander, around 300 BCE, Buddhist and Hindu outflows to China and India. Then this is the Muslim period in India, the Abbasid Empire, 700 current era, the Delhi Sultanate, year 1000, Mughal period. Then finally the colonial period, 1700 to the present times. In every one of these time periods, we have evidence where knowledge has gone out of India, outflowed, and we can see the evidence of that knowledge being incorporated into another system. We know that, where it was incorporated, how it was incorporated, and so on. Go to the next slide, please. Here's a sample knowledge transfer. The guru, various gurus, the Western transmitter is Pythagoras. We know that he transferred math and philosophy, and we have data points for all of these things. The guru was Yajnavalkya around 3000 BC, Western transmitters of the Babylonians and Greeks in astronomy. The sage was Canada around say 600 BCE, and the Western transmitter is somebody called Democritus who lived in 460 BCE, who worked on atomic structure, material properties, and so on. Vriddhigarga, an astronomer who lived around 500 BCE. The Western transmitter is Hipparchus. Hipparchus in 120 BCE inherited the works given to him by Aristotle. When Alexander went to India, he collected a lot of texts for his uncle. His uncle is Aristotle. And in the Aristotelian school of thought, Hipparchus got a lot of information, and he took along astronomy, what I told you, precision of equinox, mathematics, and so on. In the Western tradition, you accord the founding of trigonometry to Hipparchus, but it had a much earlier trajectory in the Indian systems, and we have evidence of some of these things too. Ammonius Saccas, who was an Indian who lived in Greece, and his greatest student was Plotinus in 300 current era. He's the founder of Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism influenced Christianity and other religions enormously, including Islam, and a lot of it is the bedrock of Brahman, the one. If you read Neoplatonism, just try to figure out what the one refers to over there, it refers to Brahman. Various gurus, people like Kanka, Al-Kindi, Al-Fazari, Al-Baruni, Darashiko, and so on, a whole lot of intellectual traditions were taken out of India, where sometimes the knowledge was destructively obtained, where after destroying the knowledge systems that were present in India, destructively obtained and transmitted from the Muslims onto the Western world through Spain, because Spain was under the Abbasid Empire. A very famous person called Gerard of Cremano, who lived in Toledo in the 12th century, was responsible for translating various Arabic texts to Latin in the 12th century. This formed the basis of the European thought as a precursor to the Renaissance period. So that was a period of time when the Christians were trying to remove more influences. The Moors were the Muslims in Spain, and having the blessings of the Pope and the Knights Templar and others, Ferdinand and Isabella Marcos, we are familiar with what happened, the Inquisition and other things that happened. It was a period of time when it was dangerous for you to say you got your knowledge from the Moors. If you said you got your knowledge from the Moors, your head would be chopped off or you'd be tortured to death and so on. So many of the Western scientists who took this knowledge promptly hid their sources. So citations went for a toss right over there. Nobody would cite where did they get this knowledge from. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you had people who were coming out of the Middle Ages from where Black Plague and other such things and living hovels and such things coming out saying, I invented this, I invented that, and where did these things come from? So that is from here. Finally, the missionaries and colonialists were also at the forefront of taking over mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, medicine, arts, and others. And we have data points for a whole lot of these things. The point in my telling these things is that we all belong to the same Guru traditions. The Gurus of India who formed a lot of wisdom and developed this wisdom were also the teachers for the rest of the world in various ways. We don't acknowledge these things today. We don't have citations that go back over there. But the intellectual honesty dictates that we should, at some point or the other, say, where does this information come from? So even though you're sitting here today, we might wonder, well, how are we connected to any of these Indic systems? Believe it or not, we are all connected intellectually, if not even philosophically. I think I'll move to the next one. So this is my last slide. So I think I gave the punchline that we are all connected intellectually and otherwise. So from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, there's a very famous mantra, and that reads, Asatoma Satgamaya, Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya, Mrityoma Amritam Gamaya. And basically it says, from the unreal lead me to the real, from the darkness lead me to the light, and from the dead lead me to the immortal. I think that more or less sums up all of our journeys as teachers, as seekers of knowledge and otherwise to in the goals that we have in our life. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for that very intellectual speech, Raji.